Thank you. Again, I wish I were with you. Because of the circumstances, the war, not everything that we wish is possible. Our main wish, of course, is the war to end and us as a people to survive as a result of this war, and that is what matters most. I'd like to start my brief intervention, my brief presentation, by saying that many people compare the war in Ukraine with two world wars of the 20th century, World War I and World War II. Indeed, there are many similarities between them. Like, for example, there is a similarity with World War I that it's a war of trenches. It happens mostly in the trenches. And also, it stumbles on stalemates when the troops, both sides cannot advance, they really just hold the positions. And of course, they inflict destruction and brutality on one another. Just in the way how it happened, like for example during the World War II, when the civilian, we know that civil buildings were destroyed, civil population suffered, many were killed, so just exactly what we experienced in Ukraine. We've reached the point of the war that I was explained by my grandfather. I remember he was fighting the Nazis in the Polish army. And we were like small boys with my brother, and he told us about the war, his experience of the World War II. He said that, in this war, you would be killed, but there is a small chance you would survive. I think we've reached this exactly point. That's exactly the experience of my brother, who just came back from the front line, and he put the war exactly in the same terms. So that's another similarity with the World War II that we have. At the same time, there are differences between the war in Ukraine and the world wars of the 20th century. But one of them, of course, are drones. They didn't have drones at that time. Now drones are the main devices of the war. Another difference is that at that time, in the World War I and II, there was no political theology that underpinned this war. And I believe that there is a strong political theology or political theologies that underpin the ongoing war in Ukraine. I would call the war in Ukraine as a war driven by political theologies. Well, it's an interesting connection between them. On the one hand, the political theologies drive this war, and then the political theologies are driven by the war as well. So it's like a mutual process when two things, two devices, help each other or impede one another. Actually, that's why it's important to study, to analyze, to understand the theologies behind this war on both sides of the war, the Russian and Ukrainian sides. And I would say that the war, the clash of the armies in this war, is a continuation of the clash of theologies behind this war. We don't have much time to analyze those theologies, so I'll just sketch very briefly some outlines of those theologies. These theologies are not just incompatible in the terms of content, but also they are different in the terms of the format. The difference in the format of the two theologies. The way in which the official Russian theologians frame this war can be described as a sort of political theology with the main focus on the state. The society is almost absent in this equation. You can see here in the triangle three angles: church, state, and society. And usually political theology is defined as the one focusing on the relations between the church and the state. And this is exactly the case, I believe, of the Russian political theology, which focuses on its relations with the state, when the state is presented as a sacred institute and ended in itself. Then you can see another side of the triangle that connects the church and the society. And I believe this is like the quintessence of the Ukrainian public theology. Usually, public theology is defined as focusing on the relationship between the church and the society, in contrast to the political theology, which focuses on the church and the state. So it's mostly the case of Ukraine that the Ukrainian theologians care about the relationship with the society, while the Russian theologians, mainstream theologians at least, they care more about the relationship with the state. So let me come back to the Russian, to describing or sketching the Russian political theology. As I said, it really venerates the state in almost, idolatrous way, I would say. The state is almost like an idol from this perspective of this theology. It promotes a sort of exceptionism, which is based on the idea of orthodoxy. Well, how they are connected. We the Orthodox believe that we are like the purest form of Christianity. As you probably know, those who encounter us in the ecumenical meetings, our kind of identity. Orthodoxy is about like purity of faith, and the Russians extrapolate this idea of purity of faith upon the exceptional role of the Russian civilization in the world. They believe that God loves Russia and wants Russia to serve, to carry out a mission, a universal global mission of preserving the purity of Christianity, of morality, of civilization, which leads to the idea of civilization exceptionalism, which is actually the gist, the quintessence of the Russian ideology, the idea of the exceptional civilization that has a mission for the world to save the world from itself. I believe that even though the Russians believe that their civilization is unique, their political theology is not. And it has affinity with some early examples of the European interwar political theology, particularly as it was articulated by Carl Schmitt, the theologian, German theologian, well known to most people, well, in this room and in the West, in the Western theological realms. Carl Schmitt, as we know, endorsed the Nazi regime. He was very active in the realm of law studies and theological studies, and all of a sudden he became fashionable in Russia. So a wave of studies, of reflections, including academic reflections, appeared in the Russian journals, studying Carl Schmitt, reflecting on his legacy. And now we can see some common points, commonalities between Schmitt's political theology and the modern Russian political theology. I could identify at least 2 points that I'd like to briefly share with you. One is the idea of endorsing a leader who needs to stand above the law, above the framework, any legal framework. That was the case with Chancellor Adolf Hitler, who needed this kind of justification for going beyond the constitution as it was envisaged by the Weimar Republic, and the need for President Vladimir Putin to play a role which is not envisaged by the Russian constitution, which is above the Russian constitution. So that's exactly the sort of task for both political theologians of Schmitt and of modern Russian theologians. Another point of convergence is the idea of katechon. Katechon, it's a biblical term, as you know, it goes back to Paul. And in the interpretation of Carl Schmitt, katechon is a power, political power that keeps the world together, that holds world as one piece, and that preserves, the political system from decadence. And that's exactly the same role envisaged for the Russian president by the political theologians in Russia. Well, those are a couple of many points of convergence between the interwar European political theologies, with Carl Schmitt as the protagonist of them, and the modern Russian political theology. I don't have time to explore them more. I need to switch to the Ukrainian public theology as an example of the opposite standpoint regarding many points. The most important, as I said, is this connectedness with the society, which is much more important for the Ukrainian public theology than it is for the Russian political theology. So Ukraine is really about relationships with the society. And this goes, probably at this point, I will just switch off the sharing. I stop sharing. And yeah, and I will dwell a bit closer on this relationship between the Ukrainian churches and society. It goes back to the history of the Ukrainian revolutions during the last, at least 20 years. It started with the Orange Revolution in 2004 and then continued with the so-called Euromaidan, or the Revolution of Dignity, in the winter 2013-2014, when this revolution, even though it was a very political, very secular event, it was underpinned by some religious ideas and by some theologies. Then I believe the Ukrainian public theology really became fully bodied, emerged as a distinct discipline. So the Ukrainian public theology is essentially the theology of the Maidans somehow, and that's hence its focus on the relationship with the society, because the revolutions in Ukraine, they're usually they're about the clashes between the state and the society. The societies do not reconcile with the state; they oppose themselves to the state, and this clash of the state and the society became reflected in the character of the Ukrainian public theology, which chooses the society instead of the state. Also, it chooses the horizontal relations in the society and in the churches. That's why it's very egalitarian, this sort of theology, Ukrainian public theology. It cherishes, it focuses exactly on the horizontal relations between people, between communities, between political bodies, in contrast to the Russian political theology, which is very much vertical based. It's about maintaining, preserving the vertical of power in the Russian political milieu. It started in this way, the Ukrainian public theology, and quite surprisingly, I should say, it's quite coincidentally, or even providentially, you may say, exactly in this form, the Ukrainian public theology helps us fighting this war. So all those principles of the Ukrainian public theology, as they were articulated in the Maidan, are very helpful now in the situation of the war, because this war, it is said, it has been observed, the difference between the strategies, the Russian strategy and the Ukrainian strategy in the war, is that the Russians, at least in the first stages of the war, the Russians relied very much on the vertical power, the vertical chain of command, while the Ukrainian forces, their strong point were the horizontal relations between the troops, between the units and individuals. And that's exactly the intuition, the main intuition of the Ukrainian public theology, that endorses this kind of relationship. So it really helps us fighting this war. And what is important, this theology is quite open-ended. It is open to the further evolution. It will certainly evolve. And my hope, and that's how I would like to conclude my presentation now, because my time is running out, is that I hope that this sort of public theology that we still need to articulate more clearly, I hope will help us to rebuild Ukraine. So it will not start with, it started with the Maidan. It did not end with the Maidan. It continued with the war. And I hope it will not end with the war. It will continue with the rebuilding of the country. And that's why we need this public theology for the future after the war. We need this public theology to be articulated commonly with our ecumenical partners and friends. I hope such fora as yours may help us in doing so. So thank you for listening to my presentation. I'm open to our discussion.